We'll follow the order, I think, on which they're on the website. So we'll start with Dr. Ned Dobos from University of New South Wales, Canberra, on militarism and faith in the institutions of violence. Ned, over to you.
Thanks, Alex. And thanks to the Institute of Advanced Studies at Loughborough for putting this on. I'm going to start with a couple of observations. The first is this: with regards to most any social institution, our appraisal of its competence and its effectiveness will vary depending on its performance, naturally. All right, so institutions tend to gain or lose public trust by succeeding or failing in their objectives. But there's one notable exception to that rule, and that's the military. So we've got empirical evidence now, for example, that even though most Americans regard their military's most recent operations in Afghanistan and Iraq as abject failures, those same people have more confidence in their military establishment than in any other social institution. And if anything, confidence in the armed forces is only trending upwards. Now that needs some explaining, right? You'd expect 2 decades of admitted failure to have some negative bearing on the perceived likelihood of success moving forward. But instead, what we see is that predictions of future performance have been severed off from appraisals of past performance. So you ask Americans, how do you think the military has performed? Not very well. How do you think the military will perform in future operations? Pretty well, right? So to be a little bit more precise, when a military operation fails, that's not ever seen as evidence of military incompetence or effectiveness. Rather, the narrative tends to be that the failure is the result of inadequate civilian support for the military. So insufficient funding or too many legal and ethical constraints, lack of morale, whatever the case may be. So when the military fails, it's not the military's fault, it's ours apparently. It's not the tool that's defective, it's the user. And I mentioned this last time, what a kind of striking example of this was in the Atlantic, the day after the last American troops flew out of Kabul. They had a headline in the Atlantic which said, "Afghanistan is your fault," and then went on to explain how the civilian population, the parent society, is to blame for this military failure. All right. So that's my first observation. Failed military operations don't reduce the perceived effectiveness of military force. Second, trust in the military is also unaffected by what we might call perverse military operations. And by a perverse military operation, I simply mean the use of military force for purposes contrary to the ones that justify the existence of the military in the first place. There's probably a few possibilities here, but the most obvious example is that of a military coup. We set up a military to defend us, and then that military attacks us. So the National Armed Forces turn against the nation or the state that they're supposed to defend. That's the paradigm example of what we might call a perverse military operation. And these episodes don't have any bearing on our trust in armed forces either. So you might think of it this way. There might be some exceptions, but none that I've encountered yet. Overwhelmingly, at least, we can say that the response to the Russian invasion of Ukraine from other countries has been, this proves that we need to maintain an effective military. And so they've been investing a whole lot more money into their militaries, from Japan to Germany, all over Australia. But we don't look at the military coups that have happened in the last few years. So the 3 most recent are Sudan, Burkina Faso, and Myanmar. We don't look at those and say, you see, this is why it doesn't make sense to have a military, or it's dangerous to have a military. So some statistics, and I've added a bit here. So since 1950, there have been 470 coup attempts. That's As much as 80% of countries in sub-Saharan Africa have experienced a coup over this period, 76% of countries in North Africa and the Middle East, 67% of countries in Latin America. And that works out to an average of around 9 coup attempts every year for 50 years. Between 1950 and 2012, not a single year went by without a coup attempt somewhere in the world. And some countries are just abnormally coup prone. So Bolivia, for example, in that period, nobody's trying to attack it, had 23 coup attempts, right? Imagine hiring a security guard and giving him all this money. And then every other day, he's just beating you up, right? But yet this doesn't make a dent in the trust that we have in these institutions. So the upshot is, confidence in the military has become quite rigid. It doesn't get updated or revised in light of failures and war crimes and coups or any other countervailing evidence. This is why I call the paper Faith in the Institutions of Violence. It's not just confidence, it's faith, the kind that you'll find amongst kind of religious fundamentalists, where you tell them about the fossil record, and they'll say, "Oh, the devil put that there to test our belief in Jesus." All right, so why is this? How did the military come to find itself in this position where it's effectively immune from revision? Hasn't been studied rigorously. There is one quite good paper that I would recommend by David Burback from the US Naval War College. The title is Gaining Trust While Losing Wars, where he speculates as to why this is. One possibility that he flags is that confidence in the military has become, in many countries, a kind of proxy for patriotism or a requirement of patriotism. So I am a patriot, therefore I must be positively disposed towards the military, since the troops are the embodiment and the instantiation of the nation, something like this. And so since no other social institution enjoys that kind of intimacy with the nation, I can be critical of the Department of Education or the NHS or the government itself, but that doesn't impugn my patriotic credentials. Whereas with armed forces, there's this perceived tension between being a patriot and any kind of negativity towards the military establishment. So that's one reason the military enjoys this kind of immunity to evidence, according to Burback. Another related claim, which I find particularly interesting, is that a lack of confidence in the troops might be perceived as, or even felt as, experienced as, a lack of gratitude or a lack of appreciation for the troops. And therefore, people who feel that they ought to be grateful to the military for what they've done, thank you for your service, they won't admit even to themselves a lack of confidence in the armed forces, because that would induce a kind of cognitive dissonance. So as an aside, this is why I find war commemoration quite problematic, and not just the kind that glorifies or celebrates war. Any kind of war commemoration, insofar as its purpose is to cultivate gratitude. If Burback is right, the effect of that is that gratitude can occlude unbiased appraisals of what our armed forces are and are not capable of. Okay, we'll never admit that they're doomed to failure at something, because we'd feel like ingrates. So these are just some of the explanations that Burback gives as to why confidence in the military goes up even when performance goes down. All that's certainly plausible. One thing that I think is missing from his analysis is any talk of the role that the military itself plays in cultivating confidence in it. So in his analysis, the military is just a passive beneficiary of the public's unwavering confidence. There are deeper socio-cultural reasons for it, but the military doesn't produce those. But in reality, the military is very much active in manufacturing public trust. And this is the part of the paper that I really need to research much more rigorously, but defense establishments normally have fairly sizable public relations divisions, and the purpose of these public relations divisions is precisely to cultivate a positive image of the organization. They protect the brand, just like PR does in any other organization, to portray it as competent and effective and professional, ethical, so on. And now I want to be clear, this is not me talking about propaganda. You can use that word. I don't want to because I don't need to. This is just the stated purpose of the public relations wings of defense establishments. So this is just from their websites, public domain. This is from the US. You've got the Army Public Affairs Unit. Its function, according to the website, is, quote, to establish conditions that lead to confidence in America's army and to maintain the trust of the American public. In Australia, you've got something called the MEC, which is effectively the same, but it stands for Ministerial and Executive Coordination and Communication Division. It's a division of defense whose mandate is, quote, to build and improve defense's public standing and to shape the narrative of defense. Its communication priority is to, quote, highlight defense's operational effectiveness and how defense is reforming to maintain a capability edge. Not surprisingly, the Pentagon is kind of light years ahead of everyone here. And I can't help but share this example. Again, this is from the book by Christopher Coyne and Abigail Hall, Manufacturing Militarism. So if you don't know, there's a new film, what's it called? Theaters of War, that shines a light on this, but the US military regularly makes its resources available to TV and film studios and even game studios, design, whatever you call them, game houses. So if you're making an action blockbuster, for example, and you want to film something on an aircraft, you can ask the Pentagon to use one of theirs for a day, and they might let you on the condition that they vet and approve the entire script. And so you could see where that's going. That's how the defense establishment gains creative control over TV shows and movies and use this to manipulate their image. And here's the example that I really like. It's from the show Lassie, which you remember Lassie? Okay, so there was an episode where Lassie discovers a downed military aircraft and rescues those within. So the producers approached the military to support one of these episodes because they needed to film the aircraft. And here's what ensued. I'll just read this verbatim. In one proposed episode, Lassie, the canine heroine, saves the day by uncovering the mystery of a crashed military aircraft. In the original version of the script, the aircraft crashed because of a design flaw. In response, the Pentagon Film Office wrote to producers, "We suggest that the L-19 aircraft be depicted as having encountered unpredictable icing conditions instead of a design flaw." They didn't like in the kind of analysis of this, they didn't like the implication that the military would buy something with flaws but it gets better. So the last line in the synopsis for the original script says that Lassie solves the mystery and no lives will be endangered because of it. But that last part was taken out by the Pentagon Film Office. In the script approved by the Army, Lassie is still a good detective, but she is no longer a hero because no lives have been saved by her. This was to make Lassie look less heroic so that the military characters would look better instead. And you don't want the dog to outshine the soldiers. So that's really the extent of the Pentagon's involvement in some of these scripts. Now, when the Pentagon refuses to support a film or a TV show, the reason that they give is it depicts the most common reasons that they give are it depicts military incompetence, military unprofessionalism, or failure. Now, the way they justify, when the Public Relations Department, what they'll have us believe is that when they refuse to support a film or a TV show, it's on the grounds of accuracy. So they refuse to support films that portray the military unrealistically. That's the line that they run, and that sounds fair enough. right? But now the question is, what do they consider unrealistic? And I found the answer. There was a guy called Phil Strubb. He was the head of the Pentagon Film Office from 1990 to 2018. And he was asked this question, what do you mean by accurate? And his response was, quote, any film that portrays the military as negative is not realistic to us. Right. All right, so militaries play a role in producing the very attitudes that insulate perceptions of their effectiveness. They're not passive recipients of some psychological process that just happens organically to their advantage. Our faith in the military is cultivated by the military. Now, okay, so the last question is, so what's wrong with this? All other organizations and brands do it. What's wrong with the military doing it? Perhaps the answer that would most interest the people that are joining us here today is, I think it contributes to kind of institutional inertia. So we're never going to find the political will to move to something better, some other arrangement for national defense, if we believe that the current arrangement works pretty darn well, better than any other institution we've got in society. So I remember when I first started reading Gene Sharp and all of these methods of nonviolence and how effective they are, and even some of the proposals for how to create a national defense institution using these methods. And I went to talk to one of my colleagues in the office next door. I told him all about it. And his response was, yeah, but we've already got a perfectly good military. Wouldn't this just be duplicating efforts and funding to create this other thing? So the belief that the military functions very effectively undermines the incentive to move beyond it, particularly among people that aren't like us and don't necessarily have a strong principled objection to violence. As long as they believe that the military works really well, they're going to be comfortable with it. So if you want to convince people that we should stop relying on military force and invest in something else, you've got to convince them that the military isn't nearly as effective as they think it is. So that's one reason faith in the military, I think, is a bad thing. It all but guarantees that we'll never transition to superior alternatives, superior ethically and in terms of effectiveness as well. Besides this, though, my main reason for being worried about this faith in the armed forces is overconfidence leads to overuse. Okay, and that goes both domestically and internationally. The more confidence we have in this institution, the more we'll tend to use it. And most of those uses will be unjust ones. So on the domestic front, here's a recent example from my part of the world. The vaccine rollout in Australia was handled very poorly. So the government essentially didn't order enough vaccines. In order to try and restore public confidence, the government put the army in charge of the vaccine rollout, and they called it Operation COVID Shield, right? So they put the army in charge, they militarized the name, and even the most confronting thing was the daily television updates that you'd get on the news about vaccine supplies and so on. They weren't given by a public health expert. They weren't given by a public servant or even a politician. They were given by Lieutenant General John Fruin in full military uniform with all of his decorations and medals every day. So that's what happens when there's this impenetrable confidence in the military. Civilian functions and powers get reassigned to the military because we trust it more than we trust the public health service, even on public health matters. So you get this distortion of the proper division of labor at home. More worrying, though, is I think this is what leads to overuse of the military for military operations abroad. So what ought to happen is if a state keeps going on these military misadventures to change the regime over here, to deliver, to liberate the people over there, to install democracy at this place, if they keep doing that and they keep failing despite lots and lots of years passing and lots of money spent, that should be taken as prima facie evidence that the military is incapable of achieving this stuff. But so it should reduce our confidence in the institution and thereby make us less likely to go on further such misadventures. When I say that should happen, I don't just mean rationally and prudently, I think ethically, right? It's not justifiable to initiate a military operation, doesn't have a reasonable prospect of success. That's, just war theory 101. But the problem is, as long as our confidence in the military is inoculated against disconfirming evidence, we'll insist that the military always has a reasonable prospect of success, regardless of its past failures. So the stubborn confidence in the military impairs our ability to impartially apply the principles of just war theory. It kind of rigs the game psychologically in favor of deployment. I'll end with this. So what's the solution? What do we do about this? I think there are things that we can do as scholars and things that ordinary citizens can do. The main institutional change that I can think of, and maybe this is going too far, I'd like to hear what you think, but I think there's just a case to be made for completely defunding things like the Army Public Affairs Unit and the Pentagon Film Office, and any other outfit whose purpose is to manage and manipulate public perceptions of the armed forces. And my operating principle here is simply this: social institutions should not be funded to do things that predictably increase the likelihood of their own overuse or misuse. And that's essentially what they are doing with these activities. I'll stop there. Thanks.